The Oakwood maximum security prison was located 30 miles from San Bernardino, among the hills scorched by the Californian sun. Gray concrete walls, barbed wire on 20-foot-high fences, 8 watchtowers. Inside, there were about 1,200 inmates. This place operated according to its own rules, strict, unchanging, cruel in their simplicity. Gerta Wright arrived at work at 6:30 a.m., as usual. Wednesday, October 23rd. Her white Honda was parked in the staff parking lot next to a dozen other staff cars. 34 years old, divorced for 3 years, no children. A medical coordinator is not a doctor or a nurse in the traditional sense, but an administrative worker with medical training. She was responsible for distributing medication, coordinating doctors' visits, medical records, and preventive examinations. She had worked here for 6 years, 6 years of the same routine. Gerta passed through the metal detector at the main entrance and showed her pass to the guard, James, an elderly man with a tired face who had worked here longer than she had. He nodded without even looking at the photo. He knew her face by heart. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and something else, a smell that is impossible to describe, but which is present in all prisons. The smell of time standing still within concrete walls. The medical unit was located on the second floor of the West Wing, a small office with 2 desks, medicine cabinets behind bars, a computer, stacks of files. Her colleague, Linda Martinez, was already there, a heavy-set woman in her 50s who had worked there for 15 years and had long since lost any illusions about the system. "Good morning," Gerta said, hanging her coat on a hook. "Good morning," Linda said, without looking up from her computer. "We have scheduled checkups in Block D today. 23 people. Dr. Sanchez will be here at 9. Gerta nodded and sat down at her desk. She opened the list of inmates for today. Names, numbers, brief medical notes. Most were standard. Blood pressure checks, complaints of back pain, headaches, insomnia. Some requested antidepressants. Many were faking it to get time out of their cells. At 9:05, Dr. Sanchez appeared, a short man in his 60s who came 3 times a week from his private practice. He examined the prisoners quickly, mechanically, asking a minimum of questions. Gerta accompanied him to the medical office in Block D. The prisoners were brought in one at a time, handcuffed and accompanied by guards. Each examination took no more than 5 to 7 minutes. At around 10 o'clock, George Rhines was brought in. 29 years old, 4th year of his sentence. 7 years for armed robbery of a store, his first and only crime. The case file said he was remorseful and had no previous convictions. Education: 2 years of college, interrupted due to financial problems. Inside the prison, he worked in the library, helping other inmates with legal documents. Exemplary behavior. Gerta had seen his file dozens of times in recent months. George entered. The guard removed his handcuffs and remained at the door. Tall, thin, with short dark hair. His face was calm, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. He looked at Gerta for a moment, less than a second, but there was something in his gaze that made her look away. "Sit down." Dr. Sanchez pointed to a chair. Standard questions. Complaints? No. Pain? No. Sleep? Normal. Sanchez took his blood pressure, checked his throat, listened to his lungs. 7 minutes. "Everything's fine. You can go." George stood up. As he walked past Gerta's desk, where her medical records lay, he paused for a second. He looked at her again. He didn't say a word. The guard put the handcuffs on, and they left. Gerta felt her heart beat a little faster. The day passed in the usual routine. Lunch in the staff canteen, lasagna reheated in the microwave, coffee from the vending machine. Linda complained about problems with her knees. Gerta nodded and hardly listened. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she went down to the administrative wing to submit her weekly reports. The security chief's office was at the end of the corridor. Dennis Walter, 48 years old, 20 years in the prison system, the last 8 as head of security at Oakwood. A tall, heavily built man with graying temples and a stern face. He ran the prison security like a military operation. Discipline, control, zero tolerance for weakness. Gerta knocked on the open door. "Miss Wright." Walter looked up from his papers. "Reports?" "Yes." She placed the folder on his desk. He leafed through the pages without inviting her to sit down. Gerta stood waiting. Walter always checked documents in her presence, meticulously, slowly. It was his way of showing control. "Everything looks correct." He finally closed the folder. He looked at her. "How are you feeling?" The question was unexpected. "Fine, thank you." "You look tired. Maybe you should take a couple of days off?" "I'm fine." Walter nodded but continued to look at her longer than necessary. There was something in his gaze that always made Gerta feel uncomfortable. Not exactly unprofessional, but too attentive, too personal. She left the office, feeling his gaze on her back. At 4 o'clock, Gerta went to the prison library to pick up the medical reference book she had ordered through interlibrary loan. The library was located on the first floor, a small room with metal shelves and worn books. George Raines stood behind the librarian's desk, sorting through a stack of returned books. He worked here 5 days a week, the only inmate allowed to do this job. The guard sat by the door, looking at his phone. "Hello." Gerta approached the desk. "You should have some books for the medical unit." George looked up. "Yes, just a minute." He walked between the shelves and returned with 3 books in blue covers. He placed them on the desk in front of her. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Their fingers touched briefly as she took the books. An electric shock ran through her arm. Gerta pulled her hand back too sharply, and one of the books fell to the floor. "I'm sorry." George bent down to pick it up. "No, I'll..." Gerta bent down too. They ended up at eye level, both crouching near the table. For a second, maybe 2, they just looked at each other. The security guard at the door couldn't see them behind the shelves. "Be careful," George said quietly. "Not about the book." Gerta picked up the book and stood up. Her heart was pounding. "Thank you," she repeated, and quickly left the library. At 6 o'clock, the workday was over. Gerta passed through security and went out to the parking lot. The California sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky orange and red. She got into her car but didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there, holding the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, she saw Dennis Walter leave the building and head for his black pickup truck. He glanced in her direction, pausing for a second, then got into his car and drove away. Gerta started the engine. On the way home, she thought about George's fingers touching her hand, about his words, about Walter's gaze in the rearview mirror. Something was beginning, or had already begun. She wasn't sure when exactly it had happened, but the line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. It all started 6 months ago. April, a muggy day when the air conditioning in the medical unit broke down and the temperature rose to unbearable levels. George Raines came in for a routine checkup, complaining of insomnia. Dr. Sanchez was on vacation, and Gerta examined the prisoners herself, checking basic indicators, recording complaints, prescribing what she could within her authority. George sat in front of her, and she asked him the standard questions. But he didn't respond like the other prisoners. He spoke in complete sentences, looked her in the eye, and didn't cross any boundaries. He was polite. When she asked about his insomnia, he honestly admitted that he just wanted to get out of his cell for half an hour, to be somewhere else. Gerta should have sent him back. Instead, she gave him a mild sleeping pill and noted in his chart that his symptoms required observation. 2 weeks later, he came back. Then again. By June, it had become routine. Once a week, George would show up for a checkup with some minor complaint. They talked. First about his health, then about the books he read in the library, then about his life before prison. He had studied economics in college. He dreamed of starting his own business. One mistake, one moment of stupidity in a moment of despair, ruined everything. Gerta talked about herself, about her divorce 3 years ago, about her empty apartment, about her job that took up all her time but didn't fill the void, about how she once wanted children, but time had passed. He touched her hand for the first time at the end of June, by accident, when she was taking his pulse. His fingers lingered on her wrist for a moment. She didn't pull away. The first kiss happened in mid-July, late in the evening, when she stayed behind to sort through some documents. George brought books from the library, the official reason for his presence in the medical unit after hours. The guard who was supposed to accompany him had fallen asleep at the door in the hallway. They were alone in the office for 3 minutes. 3 minutes that changed everything. After that, they met once, maybe twice a week. Always late at night, always for a few minutes, always at risk. Gerta knew all the surveillance cameras in the medical wing, knew the blind spots, knew the guard shift schedule. George found ways to get there, through his work in the library, through fake medical requests, through connections with other prisoners who covered for him. It was madness. Gerta understood this with every fiber of her being, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. October 27th, Saturday. Gerta sat in the bathroom of her apartment, holding a pregnancy test in her hands. 2 lines, clear, bright, undeniable. Her hands were shaking. 4 months, maybe a little more. She hadn't even noticed when her period stopped. She blamed it on stress, age, hormonal changes. But her body knew. The slight nausea in the mornings, which she ignored. The fatigue. The slight weight gain, which she hid under loose shirts. She stared at the test and couldn't form a single thought. Panic, horror, something like joy. It all mixed together. On Monday, she came to work in a loose-fitting dark shirt that hid her figure. She tried not to make eye contact with Linda, not to attract attention. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, George was supposed to bring new medical journals from the library, their codes, their way of seeing each other without arousing suspicion. He came accompanied by security guard Tommy Williams, a young guy who was often distracted by his phone. George put the journals on Gerta's desk. Between the pages of one of them was a folded note, another way they communicated. Gerta took the journals and nodded. The security guard had already turned toward the door. She met George's gaze for a second, and he saw something in her eyes. Alarm. Fear. That evening, when she unfolded the note in her empty office, there were only 3 words written in his narrow handwriting. What happened? They met on Wednesday evening. Gerta stayed after her shift, telling Linda she needed to finish the medication inventory. George arrived at 8:30, when the guards were changing shifts, when the corridors were empty, when the cameras were switched off for a few minutes. The medical office. The door was closed. The lights were dimmed. Gerta didn't know how to say it. She just handed him the test she had been carrying in her pocket for 3 days. George stared at the plastic strip for a long time. A very long time. His face was expressionless. He had learned to control his emotions during his years in prison, but his hands were shaking when he handed the test back. "Are you sure?" Gerta nodded. The silence stretched on forever. Then George hugged her, gently, as if afraid of breaking her. His breath was uneven against her ear. "I don't know what to do," Gerta whispered. "We'll find a way." It was a lie, and they both knew it. What way could there be? He was a prisoner. She was a prison employee who had broken every rule and law possible. If this came out, she would be fired and could face criminal charges. He would be transferred to another prison and given a longer sentence. But at that moment, in the dark office, holding each other, they allowed themselves to dream. George talked about being released in 3 years. They would go somewhere far away, where no one knew them. They would start over. Gerta listened and almost believed. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the prison psychologist, noticed changes in Gerta in early November. They sometimes crossed paths in the hallways, sometimes had lunch together in the staff cafeteria. Rodriguez was observant by profession. She noticed things others missed. Gerta started wearing different clothes. She avoided conversation. She seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. During one of their lunches, Rodriguez asked if everything was okay. "Just tired," Gerta replied. "Maybe you should see a doctor. You look pale." "I'm fine, really." Rodriguez didn't insist, but she continued to observe. On Friday, November 13th, Rodriguez stayed late, working on a report in her office on the first floor. Around 9 p.m., she stepped into the hallway, heading for the exit, and saw George Rains walking toward the medical unit with a security guard. It was an unusual time for a medical visit. Rodriguez didn't follow them, but something made her pause. 10 minutes later, she was passing the medical unit and heard voices coming from the office. The door was not completely closed. Gerta's voice, quiet, tense. George's voice, even quieter. Rodriguez didn't eavesdrop, but a suspicion arose in her mind, which she tried to dismiss. It was impossible. It was unprofessional to even think about it. But the suspicion didn't go away. Dennis Walter noticed something else. He had been watching Gerta for years, ever since she started working at Oakwood. At first, it was just professional attention. Then it became something more, something he didn't even admit to himself. He had seen how she had changed in recent months. She had become more withdrawn. She wore baggy clothes. She avoided his gaze, when before she had always been polite and open. Walter began checking the surveillance camera recordings, at first by accident, then systematically. The medical wing, the library, the corridors. Nothing obvious, but small things. George Rains was in the medical wing too often. Gerta stayed behind after her shift more often than usual. On November 18th, Dennis Walter found what he was looking for. A recording from July 23rd, 3 o'clock in the morning. He was reviewing archives from a month ago, methodically checking every night shift. The medical wing, the corridor near Gerta's office. The camera captured George Rains entering the office accompanied by a security guard, Tommy Williams. The official reason: acute toothache requiring immediate pain relief. Walter fast-forwarded the recording. The guard remained in the corridor, leaning against the wall. 2 minutes later, his head dropped. He had fallen asleep. George was inside the office for 7 minutes, too long for simply handing over a pill. Walter continued searching. He found 4 more similar entries from the last 3 months. Always late at night. Always when Gerta stayed late after her shift. Always the same patterns. That was enough. On Tuesday, November 20th, Walter called Gerta into his office. A routine request through the internal system. Need to discuss medical protocols. 3 p.m. Gerta arrived on time. Walter closed the door behind her, a gesture that made her tense. Usually, the door remained open. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the chair in front of his desk. Gerta sat down. Walter did not. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You've been working here for 6 years. Impeccable reputation. No complaints, no problems." Gerta remained silent, feeling her heart race. And then something changed. Walter took a folder out of his desk drawer and placed it in front of her. George Rains, 23 visits to the medical unit in the last 6 months. On average, an inmate visits the medical unit 3 or 4 times a year. Gerta clasped her hands on her knees, trying to keep a straight face. "He has chronic problems with—" "He has no chronic problems," Walter interrupted. "I checked his medical records. He's perfectly healthy." Silence. Walter leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "I've seen the records, Gerta. I know what's going on." The air in the office became too thick. Gerta couldn't breathe. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." His voice didn't rise, but it became harder. "I've been working here for 20 years. I've seen this before. I know what it looks like." He straightened up and walked over to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the prison yard below. "Do you understand what you're doing? You're destroying your life, and his life too." Gerta didn't answer. Her thoughts raced, trying to find a way out, to understand how much he knew. Walter turned around. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something more personal. "I can help you. I can forget about this. I'll transfer Rains to another block. You'll stop contacting him. Everything will remain confidential." He paused. "But only if you stop this now." It wasn't an offer of help. It was blackmail. Gerta left Walter's office in a daze. She worked mechanically for the rest of the day, unable to concentrate. Linda asked her several times if everything was okay. Gerta nodded and continued filling out documents, seeing only Walter's face before her eyes. In the evening, she wrote a note to George. It was short. "He knows. We need to meet." The next day, Wednesday, they met in the library. Gerta came for reference books. George was working at the counter. The security guard stood at the door, but far enough away. They spoke quietly, pretending to discuss books. Gerta told him about Walter's threats. George listened, his face turning to stone. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. "I can't just quit. I can't lose you. And the baby." George looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that Gerta wanted to cry right there among the bookshelves. "Then we fight," he said. Gerta made her decision on Friday. She would write an official statement to the prison administration. She would confess everything herself before Walter did. She would explain the situation and take full responsibility. Maybe that would soften the blow for George. It would ruin her career. It might lead to prison time. But there was no other way. She told George about it in a short note on Monday. He replied with one word. "When?" "Tuesday. Tomorrow." But someone found out about her plan earlier. On Tuesday, November 25th, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Gerta noticed something strange. Walter was standing in the hallway outside her office, talking to someone on the phone. When she walked by, he fell silent. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. There was something cold and determined in his gaze. Gerta quickened her pace. She stayed late at work that evening. She needed to finish the report she would submit tomorrow along with her resignation letter. Documentation of all the violations she had committed. A full confession. Linda left at 6. Dr. Sanchez left at 6:30. By 8 o'clock, the medical unit was empty. Gerta sat at the computer, typing the last lines. The building around her hummed with familiar sounds, the clang of bars, the distant voices of guards, the hum of ventilation. At 9 o'clock, she printed the document. 10 pages, her confession, her end. At 9:30, she gathered her things. She locked her office. She walked down the hallway to the exit. The hallways were half empty at this hour. The shift change was at 10. Most of the day, staff had already left. Gerta walked past the administrative wing, past Walter's office. The light in his office was off. She hadn't seen him since 4 o'clock. As she passed the laundry room in the basement corridor, the shortest route to the exit, someone called out to her. "Miss Wright." Gerta turned around. The voice called out to her from the darkness of the laundry room. The door was ajar, and only one dim light was on inside. Gerta froze in the hallway, clutching her folder of documents. Every instinct told her to leave, but she recognized the voice. The invitation to come in sounded like an order. Gerta stepped over the threshold. The room greeted her with the smell of bleach and laundry detergent, stinging her throat. 4 industrial washing machines, 2 dryers, metal racks along the walls. The single lamp on the ceiling gave off a yellowish, hospital-like light, leaving the corners in deep shadow. The figure stood against the far wall between the washing machines. The face was half hidden in shadow, but Gerta knew who it was. The conversation began with reproaches. She tried to explain that she had no choice, that she had to confess herself. The voice in front of her became harsher and harsher, talking about her ruined reputation, about 20 years of work that would go to waste because of her stupidity. He offered her one last chance, to destroy the statement right now, get rid of the baby, forget George. Gerta refused. One word, firm and final. It all happened in seconds. Hands grabbed her shoulders with such force that it knocked the air out of her lungs. They turned her around and pressed her back against the cold metal of the washing machine. The folder with the documents fell, and the papers scattered across the dirty floor. Gerta tried to scream, but a hand covered her mouth, pressing her lips so hard that she tasted blood. A voice whispered in her ear that this shouldn't have happened, that it was her own fault, that there was no choice. The hand moved from her mouth to her throat. The fingers tightened. Gerta scratched the attacker's hands, pushed, tried to reach his face, but the grip only tightened. The air stopped flowing. Her lungs burned. The world around her began to blur, the yellow light of the lamp turning into a white spot. She thought of George, of the child who would never be born, of the future that would never be. The last sensation was cold metal under her back and a heavy weight pressing down on her stomach. Then darkness engulfed everything. The figure stood over the body for several minutes, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. A plan quickly took shape. They needed evidence pointing to an obvious suspect. A plastic access card, stolen 3 days ago, was taken out of a pocket. It was placed next to the body where it could be easily found. Look around. Make sure nothing has been forgotten. Leave the papers on the floor. They will only confirm the motive. Leave. Close the door. Disappear into the prison corridors. Wednesday, November 27th, 6:15 in the morning. Carlos Mendez discovered the body when he came to open the laundry room for the morning shift. The door was closed, but not locked. Strange, because he was usually the first to open the room. When he turned on the light, he saw a woman between the washing machines. She was wearing a medical uniform, her hair covering her face, her arms stretched out unnaturally. Carlos ran out into the corridor and found the nearest guard. 15 minutes later, the laundry room was cordoned off. The police were called. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 7:45. 42 years old, 18 years with the county police, permanent fatigue in his eyes, and the cynical gaze of a man who had seen too much. His divorce 2 years ago had left him with an empty apartment and his job as his only purpose in life. The technicians were already working at the crime scene. Chen put on gloves and shoe covers and entered the laundry room. The smell of bleach mingled with something else, the beginning of the smell of death. Gerta Wright lay on her back between 2 washing machines. Her head was turned to one side, her hair was tousled. There were clear bruises on her neck from fingers, large male hands. Her face was blue, her eyes open and staring into space. Her arms were spread out, and there were traces of blood and skin under her fingernails. She had fought back. Medical examiner Barbara Cole was working next to the body, making preliminary notes. Chen crouched down, studying the scene. Classic strangulation. The victim had resisted, but the attacker was stronger. Barbara showed him her conclusions without words, pointing to the fingerprints on the neck, the scratches on the victim's hands, the position of the body. Time of death, between 9 p.m. and midnight. Cause, asphyxiation by strangulation. Chen stood up and surveyed the room. Papers were scattered across the floor. He crouched down to read the headlines. A statement, an admission of protocol violations, a text about a forbidden relationship with an inmate, about pregnancy, about the intention to take full responsibility. The motive lay right there, on the dirty laundry room floor. One of the technicians motioned to him. At the base of the washing machine, a few inches from the body, lay a plastic card. Chen picked it up with his glove and held it up to the light. An inmate's access card. Name, George Rains. Number, 4782B. Too convenient. Too obvious. But the obvious is often the truth. Dennis Walter testified in his office at 9 in the morning. Chen sat across from him, watching the head of security. Walter looked composed and professional, speaking in an even voice about how Gerta Wright was a model employee. No problems in 6 years of service. Then he mentioned the changes in recent months. Gerta had become more withdrawn, stayed late at work, avoided her colleagues. Walter admitted that he suspected a connection with an inmate, George Rains. He had checked the camera recordings and was going to report it to management this week. Chen took notes and asked standard questions. Walter's alibi was simple. He had left work at 6:30 p.m. and spent the evening with his wife. She would confirm this. Nothing suspicious, just the usual testimony of an employee shocked by the murder of a colleague. But Chen noticed a small detail. When Walter talked about Gerta, there was something personal in his voice. Not just professional regret, something deeper. George Rains was brought in from his cell at 10 in the morning, handcuffs on his wrists, 2 guards on either side. His face was gray, his eyes red and swollen. He already knew. Someone had told him the news before the police arrived. The interrogation took place in an empty conference room. George sat hunched over, his handcuffed hands resting on the table. Chen asked questions methodically, writing down the answers. George did not deny the relationship. He confessed to his connection with Gerta and her pregnancy. His voice broke when he spoke of her. Tears streamed down his face, and he made no attempt to hide them. When asked about his whereabouts last night, he replied that he had been in his cell since 9 o'clock, the standard curfew. Security must confirm this. When Chen showed him the access card in a transparent bag, George turned even paler. He admitted that it was his card, but said he had lost it 3 days ago. He had filed a report with security. Chen checked. The report did indeed exist. It had been filed on Friday, November 22nd. But that proved nothing. George could have deliberately reported it missing, planning to use the card later. The motive was obvious. Gerta was going to confess something that would ruin their plans for the future. Maybe they had a fight. Maybe George wanted to silence her. Everything pointed to him. George was formally arrested at 11:30 a.m. The charge, first-degree murder. He was taken back to his cell, now in the block for particularly dangerous criminals. Chen stood in the prison hallway after the arrest, reviewing his notes. The case seemed closed. Motive, means, opportunity. Physical evidence at the scene. A confession related to the victim. But something bothered him. Chen had been a detective too long to ignore his instincts. George's grief seemed genuine. A man who had just lost the woman he loved and their unborn child. Not a man who had committed murder hours earlier. The access card at the crime scene was too convenient, a piece of evidence. Too obvious. Killers smart enough to plan a crime don't usually leave their IDs next to the body. And the security log. Chen checked it twice. George had indeed been recorded on camera at 9 o'clock in the evening. The change of guard between 9 and 10 allowed for 30 minutes of lax security, but it was risky. Too risky for a planned murder. Chen returned to the prison the next morning with one goal in mind: to find what didn't fit into the picture. He started with the surveillance camera recordings, requesting the archive for the entire evening of November 26th. In the security room, behind the monitors, he methodically reviewed each camera. Medical unit. Gerta works at her computer until 9 in the evening, then packs her things. Corridor. She walks toward the exit at 9:28. Then a blind spot. The laundry room had no cameras inside, only in the corridor in front of the entrance. Chen rewound the recording to an hour earlier. At 8:42 p.m., Dennis Walter walks down the hallway near the laundry room. He walks quickly, looking back. He is carrying a folder with documents. He heads for the administrative wing and disappears around the corner. Nothing suspicious. The head of security in his own prison. But Chen kept watching. At 9:15, Walter reappears on the recording. He walks down the same corridor, but now he is walking more slowly. He stops near the laundry room door. He looks at his watch. He looks back. He goes inside. Chen checked the time. It was 9:17 p.m. 11 minutes before Gerta walks down the same hallway. The recording continues. At 9:42, Walter comes out of the laundry room, alone. He walks away quickly. His face is in shadow, but his gait is tense. Chen leaned back in his chair. Walter said he left for home at 6:30. But here he is on the recording at 9:42. A lie. Dr. Emily Rodriguez came to the police station at lunchtime. Chen asked her for a consultation. He needed a psychological perspective on the case. They sat in his office, laying out all the investigation materials on the table. Rodriguez studied the photos, notes, and statements. Chen told her about his suspicions regarding George. The grief seemed too real for a murderer. Rodriguez nodded, her professional eye assessing every detail. She began to talk about psychological profiles. George was an impulsive criminal in the past. The armed robbery was an act of desperation, not cruelty. During his 4 years in prison, he showed complete rehabilitation. Violence, especially the murder of his beloved woman and unborn child, did not fit his profile. Then Rodriguez talked about Dennis Walter. She had observed him for years in prison. He was a controlling, authoritarian personality with a deep need for order. 20 years of impeccable service. His identity was completely tied to his work. A threat to that identity could provoke an extreme reaction. And then there was the way Rodriguez noticed Walter looked at Gerta. Not just as a boss looking at a subordinate. A more personal attention that he tried to hide, but which was obvious to someone who observed human behavior professionally. An obsession wrapped up in control. Chen got a warrant to search Walter's office at 3 in the afternoon. Walter was called to the station for further questioning while the techs worked in his office. What they found filled 3 boxes of evidence. In a locked desk drawer were photos of Gerta. Lots of photos, taken secretly on prison grounds. At work, in the cafeteria, walking down the hallway. Some dated years earlier. Collected, stored, hidden. A personal diary in another drawer. Notes about Gerta, about his feelings, which he couldn't express. About jealousy when he began to suspect a connection with George. About anger. About plans to make her stop. And George Rhine's medical card marked November 22nd, the day George reported his pass missing. But in the corner of the card, written in Walter's handwriting, removed for inspection. He took the card, saying it was part of the investigation. But he never returned it. The evidence painted a picture of a man obsessed, a man who had lost control. Walter was sitting in the station's interrogation room at 6 in the evening. Chen entered with boxes of evidence and placed them on the table between them. He began methodically laying out the evidence. Security camera footage showing Walter in prison at the time of the murder. Photos of Gerta from his office. A diary. George's access card with his handwriting. Walter looked at it all in silence. His face remained stony for the first 10 minutes. Chen did not rush, simply laying out piece of evidence after piece, building an irrefutable wall of truth. When Chen opened the diary and began reading the entries aloud, entries about Gerta, about love, about hatred for George, about the desire to control her life, something broke inside Walter. His shoulders slumped. His hands, resting on the table, began to tremble. 20 years of control, 20 years of professional facades collapsed in a matter of seconds. The confession came quietly. Walter spoke monotonously, looking at the table, not at Chen. He had loved Gerta for years. He never said anything because it would have been unprofessional. But he watched, cared from afar, imagined a future where she would finally see him. When he found out about George, his world turned upside down. She chose a prisoner, a criminal. Instead of him, a man who had served the law for 20 years. The blackmail was an attempt to regain control. When Gerta refused, when she said she would file a complaint and destroy everything, his job, his reputation, his life, something inside him broke. He hadn't planned to kill her. He just wanted to talk one last time, to make her change her mind. He met her in the hallway and asked her to come into the laundry room. But when she refused again, when she called him pathetic, when she said she loved George, his hands moved on their own. He had stolen George's card a few days earlier, just in case. An instinct from 20 years of working in the system, always have a backup plan. He left it behind to send the investigation down the wrong track. Walter fell silent. Tears streamed down his face. Chen sat opposite him, writing down every word. Dennis Walter was arrested at 7:30 p.m. The charge, first-degree murder. He was led away in handcuffs, a broken man who had lost everything trying to control the uncontrollable. George Rains was released the next morning. Chen personally broke the news to him. George wasn't happy. He just nodded, and new tears streamed down his face. The acquittal didn't bring Gerta back. It didn't bring their child back. 3 months later, Chen sat in the courtroom watching the sentencing. Walter was found guilty. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. George was there too, in the public gallery. He would finish his sentence in 2 years. He would be free, but without the life he had planned with Gerta. Chen closed the case file in his office that evening. Another murder solved, another tragedy documented. The justice system had worked. But there was no victory in this. Only 3 ruined lives and 1 death that could not be undone. Chen turned off the lights and went home to his empty apartment, where only silence awaited him.